Good evening and welcome to The Bluest Eye, Book Banning and the Politics of Censorship, sponsored by the Toni Morrison Society and Literacy Partners. My name is Jonquilyn Hill, and I have the pleasure of moderating the session tonight on an author and topic with which I think we're all really familiar with. In an essay aptly titled Peril, collected in The Source of Self-Regard, Selected Speeches, Essays, and Meditation, Toni Morrison writes, "Unpersecuted, unjailed, unharassed writers are trouble for the ignorant bully, the sly racist, and predators feeding off the world's resources. The alarm, the disquiet writers raise is instructive because it is open and vulnerable, because if unpriced, it is threatening. Therefore, the historical suppression of writers is the earliest harbinger of the steady peeling away of additional rights and liberties that will follow. The history of persecuted writers is as long as the history of literature itself, and the efforts to censor, starve, regulate, and annihilate us are clear signs that something important has taken place." Joining me tonight in this conversation about that very something important that takes place every time we read a book by Toni Morrison and by so many other authors are Carolyn Dennard, founder and board chair of the Toni Morrison Society.
Good evening.
Michelle Haidt, associate professor of English and director of the Ethel Waddell Geethie Honors Program and prestigious international fellowships at Spelman College. She also serves as the first vice president of the Toni Morrison Society.
Good evening.
And Dana A. Williams is the president of the Toni Morrison Society and dean of the graduate school and professor of English at Howard University.
Good evening, everybody.
Thanks to you all for joining us. The Toni Morrison Society has partnered with Literacy Partners for this event tonight. Bringing greetings from Literacy Partners is Jasmine Jeffers, Senior Director of Institutional Advancement. Jasmine?
Thanks so much for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. As stated, my name is Jasmine Jeffers, and I work for Literacy Partners, a nonprofit that believes, above all, that literacy is the key to liberation. We offer free classes, community workshops, and educational media to low-income and immigrant parents of color across the country, with the mission of helping them to develop the literacy and language skills they need to succeed in today's world. As an adult literacy program, our origin story is in the struggle for Black liberation, from the freedom schools in the time of emancipation through the civil rights movement to Black Lives Matter today. We work with adults to develop their skills so that they can tell their own stories. At the same time, we endeavor to make the great stories of our time accessible to people who may not otherwise have access. Tonight's event occurs in conversation with our recent marathon reading of The Bluest Eye, a production of our Words Shape Our World virtual event series. Through this series, we tap into the power of our community by centering the narratives of writers like Toni Morrison, who is unapologetic, both in her depiction of the historical suffering of Black women and of the spaces for joy that we have created, despite the burdens that we've been compelled to endure. As a Black woman, The Bluest Eye is a deeply meaningful text for me, and I am so grateful to the Toni Morrison Society, both for having me here tonight and for partnering with Literacy Partners. Thank you for holding space for what I know will be an absolutely incredible discussion of this book.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. Let's start with a clip. In 1982, Toni Morrison participated in a PEN America panel of writers that was titled An Evening of Forbidden Books. Let's listen to that clip and let's set it up first. In this clip, the interviewer asks her if the justification for censorship and banning books is really about morals, as people who ban books suggest, or if it's a political act. Here's her response.
Maybe while we're waiting for Catherine to set this clip up for us, to play that clip from that quoted material, we'll tell you just a little bit about how the event really emerged, and just want to say thank you again so much to Jasmine and Literacy Partners for working with us on this particular event. As you all know, Literacy Partners did an incredible virtual reading, and some of the information that was also in the chat was equally incredible. So we're really appreciative of the opportunity to really have this conversation around banned books as we really think about censorship, and so many of the other different things that we'll be having discussions about tonight. So Catherine, were you able to share? I mean, the beauty of Zoom, of course, is there are always tech challenges. So we just want to make sure that we can share that opening clip here.
Yes.
Yep, so we're ready for it. Thank you. We're not seeing it if you see it on your end, and maybe we can pick it up. There we go. We don't have the sound though. Can you take it back and give us the sound?
Well, I don't really believe them when they say it's the obscenity in a book, this dirty word or that dirty word. It shows a level of illiteracy that's rather startling. Real obscenity takes place on many levels. What they're doing is genuinely obscene. A four-letter word has a quality of attraction as long as it is perceived of as forbidden and given a kind of life and a kind of excitement that comes from a repressed and rather distorted mind. One word's value over another. It's curious and it's sometimes humorous if it weren't so malignant that they are not preventing a child's acquaintance with those words by banning them from books that contain them. There must be a much more sinister reason. Hitler burnt books and used a phrase that's very interesting when he was condemning a certain kind of art in Munich. He said, we have to get rid of the artistic criminal. In other words, the idea of an artist as a criminal because of the production of his art is an idea that I never heard before and since. In other words, there could be such a thing as an illegal song or an illegal book. And you have to understand that I come from a race of people for whom at one time in this country, it was illegal to be taught to read. It was illegal and punishable by physical punishment and sometimes fatal punishment to learn how to read. And white people who taught Black people how to read were taking the risk of being punished. So that is more than a secular event as far as I'm concerned. And I think the same sensibilities that informed those people to make it a criminal act for Black people to read are the ancestors of the same people who are making it a criminal act for their own children to read. And I don't see a great deal of difference between that. There is some hysteria associated with the idea of reading that is all out of proportion to what is, in fact, happens when one reads. To deny a child an extraordinary book like Invisible Man, a classic, because of 3 phrases is all but madness.
I think think that Morrison gets to so much there, but I think one thing that stood out in that clip to me was the idea that denying a child an extraordinary book is madness. Carolyn, I'd love to start with you. What work needs to be done to avoid or at least limit that madness that she's talking about?
Thank you, Jonathan. I think Morrison has really laid out the landscape of the problem where you have, quite honestly, one or two people complaining about one or two words or phrase or page in a book. So we have a situation where you have people who have not read the book in context being put in a political situation where they can make decisions, not just for their children, but for all of the children in the school. And that's, as Morrison says, that's a kind of illiteracy that is obscene. And so, because you have a problem, I mean, essentially a narrow experience having very broad consequences. And I think there is some resistance, some pedagogical resistance that teachers can engage in to try to counter this. Because we can't let people who are not readers, who are not teachers, who have just chosen a few words and taken a political stand with those to keep us away from great literature. And I think there is beginning to be some resistance. You had the ACLU who, in the Missouri case, with the help of students protesting those bans. And in some places, like in Missouri, they are changing those bans and rescinding them. But I think teachers have a great responsibility. When they teach the novels, and in some cases they are under great risk if they speak out about the censorship. And quite honestly, because we haven't had a pedagogy of resistance, this is I think The Bluest Eye was first banned in 20 years after its publication in 1998. I don't know if it was because Morrison won the Nobel Prize and people just decided that they would jump on her, but Song of Solomon was banned in the 90s. And so teachers need new tools to address this issue of 3 words being able to cancel an entire novel. And as I said, I think that organizations like the Toni Morrison Society, the Penn Faulkner Foundation, the History on the Project of Black Writing, I think the National Council of Teachers of English, I think that those organizations can begin to help teachers do this work. And I think that, in fact, the Toni Morrison Society launched in 2003 the Language Matters initiatives, where we had summer institutes for teachers, high school teachers of Morrison's work. But once again, the issue there, was getting through the aesthetics of the book, understanding the thematics, trying to teach the difficult subjects. We weren't placed in the kind of political realm that teachers are placed in now. So I think now our work has to be more pointed in addressing the issues that have come up because of the censorship debate. And I think Morrison has given us the language in a talk that she did, given us the language of how we can address this issue in a new pedagogy that people with a political agenda have a problem with. And if you can show that slide. And this is a speech that she gave to launch the National Coalition Against Censorship. There's a new initiative that they started called Free Speech Leadership Council in 2009. And Morrison says at the conclusion there, she says, certain kinds of trauma visited on peoples are so deep, so cruel, that unlike money, unlike vengeance, unlike justice or rights or the goodwill of others, Only writers can translate such trauma and turn sorrow into meaning, sharpening the moral imagination. And the phrase turning sorrow into meaning, sharpening the moral imagination is, I think, the foregrounded work that teachers need to do. And some of them, in fact, are doing that. And I applaud those teachers. And you have a whole national landscape of teachers who probably need more help in their work. And I think it's incumbent upon us to begin to do that. The Bluest Eye is not just a story about a broken man raping his daughter, as the censors would have you believe, but it is about the damage of European standards of beauty in our physical person, in our homes, wherever we are, that make us feel less valued. And a story about the consequences of that, the tragic consequences of that. But it really doesn't have to be what we focus on. And I think that's what our work is to shore up those aspects of the novel that the censors are trying to take away from us. Let me just give you one example. My student, former student, Shakima Savari, who taught English in high school and for many years, and now has started her own private school. She says that she's taught Bluest Eye in Black school districts, but she says it's not just the themes of incest and sexuality that are present in the novel. It's that theme of beauty being tied to whiteness that's something we've been able to challenge in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So here she is in her classroom. We're not focusing on the last scene of the novel. We're not focusing on the racy language that people have problems with. She's focusing on what whiteness has done to self-value of Black children. And the students can identify with that. And the other thing is, focusing on the resistance, even in that novel with Claudia and Frida. And that's not what you hear. So I think we need to structure new paradigms for setting up context for understanding these novels, and take it away from the three words that and one woman said when she complained about The Beloved, she said, turn to page 13. Beloved is what, 231 pages. She says, turn to page 13, where they talk about the men having sex with cows. And so she wants to focus on that. And that's the end all and the be all of the novel. But back to Shakima, she said, when I teach the Bluest Eye, she said, I start with the doll test that psychologists did in 1940s, talking about the ways in which Black children would choose which doll is beautiful, what doll looks like you, and what are the consequences of that. So I think that what we have to do is change the narrative. And we will have to be aggressive with that, because we have people now who have political agendas. I think the fall election in 2021 was certainly a clear example of that. But we have got to change the narrative, to turn back and to say, what is the moral meaning of this text? And that is the language that Toni Morrison gave us. And this is something, she says, that only literature can do. And I would like to, be involved in that work of setting up new teaching paradigms, new pedagogies,
Mm-hmm.
how we teach the resistance to the kind of diminishing of text to 2 or 3 words, which students may or may not even pay attention to.
It would help if I unmuted myself. You would think this far into the pandemic, I'd have zoomed down by now. But there's another thread from the clip we just watched that I really want to pull on. There's an instance where she says, those who made it a criminal act are the ancestors of the same people making it a criminal act for their own people to read. And Michelle, I'm really interested in this idea of criminalizing a book or criminalizing reading, where does that push against having a more literate society come from?
Thanks so much for that question. Well, I think that a part of what you also sort of get in that clip in conversation with this is this idea of what the imagination does when it's reading, right? What is the work? At one point, she says something like, it ignores, their arguments ignore what happens when people actually read. And I think what actually happens, to sort of get back to this point of criminalizing of the artist, is that for Morrison, what the work of reading is an artistic act in and of itself. So that a part of what it means to teach this work is to teach a way of reading that rescues the practice of reading from this idea that it means that you get from beginning to the end, and that is a measure of your reading. That what happens for Morrison when you read is that you establish not only a relationship to the characters, but to the writer to complete the meaning of this work, so that there are relationships that can get made through the practice of good reading.
Mm.
And that kind of model of the possibilities for what reading can do also speak to the possibility for why we want good reading practices,
Mhm.
particularly in a democracy where we are freely making choices and making relationships. And so the practice of good reading can help make citizens who can practice making good and effective policies. And so I think it's important that we not ignore the relationship between citizenship and reading, that for Morrison become really important as the language has been taken away from us of citizenship. As she would say, we don't even talk about us as citizens anymore. We're taxpayers now.
Mhm.
And so it does sort of raise these questions about, if we got to this position as a country where we have been taken over by the language of taxpayer, is because we have been deprived of the literature that may have reinforced the meaningfulness of what it means to be a citizen,
Mhm.
right? So the work of art is not divorced from the practice of everyday citizenship and living a full life that this work often sort of models in a really rich and meaningful way from people who were denied so much in terms of their political context.
It reminds me too, Michelle, of the clip that we won't see tonight, but as we were
Mhm.
preparing for this and we were thinking about Morrison and that conversation with Angela Davis when they lay out Frederick Douglass, and he
Yeah.
associates literacy with citizenship, certainly literacy with freedom, but that freedom also speaks to some
Mhm.
level of citizenship as well. And thinking about why there are libraries in
Yeah.
civilized countries and so on. So there is something to reading and like seeing so many wonderful comments in the chat where Cherise says, for instance, because it's at the forefront of what I see here, art doesn't happen outside of society.
Mhm.
Like those things there are intersections there. And then I think that what you two were saying, really goes hand in hand with, you have to give teachers the space and permission to do the work of teaching reading and teaching context, as Carolyn was suggesting, but then for the end of like a more literate society. And to help us think about something that I've heard you say before, Carolyn, specifically about we hear from the parents, not the readers themselves.
Mhm.
Mhm.
We hear from people who are reading on behalf of someone else. And if you are able to guide the audience, the people who are reading, and hear from them, it's an interesting conversation as well. Yeah.
And I think too that part of this new pedagogy that we need to engage in is really understanding the act of reading to be good citizens, reading to be educated. I think too often we go into reading, I want you to read this book over the weekend or this week. and come back and we'll talk about it. So what did you think?
Mhm.
And my God, there is so much preparation that needs to be done before that. What does reading mean? This is Michelle has talked about. What do we hope to be able to do? How do we want to be empowered after we read this? You know, there's this case of this poor child who was having nightmares because he was reading Beloved. And I thought, well, what if the pedagogy had set him up in such a way that he was transformed to say, I don't ever want this to happen again. But you
Mhm.
see, I'm not so sure that this one-on-one reading is even the best way to do it. I don't know whether I've read these instances where teachers have to decide whether it's going to be a one-on-one reading or whether it's going to be a group reading. And I guess I value this act of reading so much that I'm not so sure that we don't need to do a group reading, or that there needs to be so much preparation of what is the outcome of this? Good citizenry, understanding the aesthetic, being self-empowered, all of those things, it seems to me, are important in the act of reading.
Especially because, to JQ's point about the quote, if you don't read well, you just repeat what has already been done because your imagination hasn't been inspired to make anything new. I mean, so then what happens is you just repeat, and that's not creating.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, we need good reading in order to have something that's different from what was done in the past.
I just want to remind our listeners that if you have a question for the panel, go ahead and put that in the Q&A, and we'll get to that later. One thread that I'm hearing that I want to pull on a little bit is what I love about Morrison's work is that she is not afraid to look at trauma, and particularly the trauma of the Black experience, head on. And I think for a lot of parents, for some reason, introducing their children to trauma, real life things that happened, is very scary for them. They want to be able to sort of dictate as much of their child's life as they can. And I'm curious, what are we losing when we don't look at that trauma head on in our literature?
Well, let me just insert this. Morrison does look at the trauma of Black lives, but that's not all those books offer. I can't think of one that is not hopeful at the end. It might, sometimes it's mythical as in Song of Solomon, or it's sentimental as in Sula, or a totally new beginning as in Jazz or something. But a book is a 300-page metaphor. And so often we take this one little piece before we see the whole work and decide that that's all there is. And so I think the kinds of questions that we ask students, certainly if we're trying to make them good citizens, need to be the kind of questions of, how are you empowered by this? What is the writer saying about our world and you in it? I just think that I don't want us to think that all Morrison is giving us a reel of trauma. She's giving us that, but she's also talking about how people survive that trauma.
Yeah, that's absolutely what she's doing. I think that's such an important point to make about Morrison's work. But I'm also thinking about this question, and I think I also am just trying to understand, like, as a parent myself, what an impossible project you set up for yourself if the goal is to avoid difficulty for your child and their confrontation with it. I mean, that is literally an impossible project. And so, I mean, you don't ever have resilient children if you don't face something that is sort of like the truth of our circumstances. I think the hope that you get in Morrison is that you can still live a full life, even with that confrontation. And so look at these people who have done it, and what might we learn from them? I think, for me, that's a part of where the hope comes from. Um, but yet that just seems to be such an impossible project. Like, how is that even the goal of good parenting? Like, I don't know. That's like,
It doesn't happen.
no, I don't know how you do that. I mean, so like, right, like then maybe a part of then not facing up to that trauma is that you have a bunch of grown children who are ill-equipped to deal with the facts of life. So I mean, and these are the people who are supposed to make policy,
Mhm.
yeah,
Well,
that doesn't,
and I think, Michelle, that Morrison gives us everything we need.
yeah,
If you stop in Beloved on the cows
yeah.
in the men,
Mm-hmm.
if you stop with the sex with Beloved and Paul D, and not get to the point of you are your own best thing,
Listen,
you have really missed
yeah,
what that text is about.
yeah,
And I guess, what is that, backward design or something? We need to
yeah,
start thinking about, where are we going with this? And I've gotten to the point with my classes that I don't play I've got a secret anymore, and you have to figure it out.
yeah.
I really want them to know where we are going,
Mm-hmm.
and to be more invested in understanding how we get there than to guess where we're going. So I think Morrison gives us those tools if we would just finish the book.
Yeah, because I
I
even think that the cows are beautiful because of what those men were doing to save themselves from being bestial to her.
That's right.
I mean,
That's
so
right.
like
To
that
say,
kind
and
of
year after
creative,
year. Mhm.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like that kind of creative humanity, given where they were located. I
Mhm.
mean, yeah, again, it's because you don't read well that you don't even understand that part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd love to get to another clip from the woman herself, Toni Morrison.
Okay.
In that same interview we watched before, she was asked the question, will this desire to ban books apply to more than narrative fiction and begin to interfere with textbooks in the publishing industry, considering textbooks are a great source of review for so many publishers? Let's take a listen to her response.
Oh, that's already happened. That's been, in fact, the case for years. When I was a textbook publisher in the late 60s, there were books that were thrown out of the list because of things such as including Hiroshima as a novel, because it was felt in this particular state that no child should be taught that his country might have made a mistake in dropping the bomb. I remember English composition books being thrown off the list because they included paragraphs by Socrates, which the textbook committee found to be, and this is their word, communistic. That has been going on for a long, long time. Publishers of textbooks for junior high school, and elementary school are extremely, only in the areas, well, particularly areas of English and social studies, not so much in the natural sciences and in math, very vulnerable to the activities of school book committees. I think trade book novelists are only recently discovering the virulence of the control of such committees.
So that's a clip from 1982, and it's as relevant today as it was 40 years ago. Right now we're still seeing bans in school, a lot of which is around critical race theory, or what's being called critical race theory. Dana, could you talk about that and talk about how it's relevant to Morrison and other banned books?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I love how she started that clip off when she said, "Oh, that's already happening." Yeah. When the interviewer is asking her, like, do you think eventually it'll move from narrative books into textbooks? Oh, that's already happening. And then, as you said, like, that was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, when people were already like very deeply afraid of what was possible through textbooks. And of course, part of what we know around textbooks, and Morrison tells us this in Plain in the Dark, essentially that the national narrative had to be crafted somewhere. And so textbooks emerge when the immigrant population comes in, and there's this need and this insistence on creating a national myth, is how she describes it. And I think she's probably right. It's not a national narrative, it's a national myth. Like, how do we begin to create a myth of American exceptionalism? And she continues to talk about it in The Origin of Others. But it's interesting that it's a kind of contemporary conversation all over again, because around that same time, we see Derek Bell emerge out of legal scholarship with the notion of critical race theory and critical race studies that has become kind of a buzzword or a dog whistle for these kind of attempts to reinscribe American exceptionalism, which equals, if we're being honest, whiteness. So the pushback against anything that does not honor and venerate American exceptionalism equals whiteness is something that we will always see and have seen, and critical race theory was clear about that, not in the literary sense, but ultimately it emerges as this legal framework and analysis in the late 70s and 80s that essentially said, as an academic concept, that the core concept is that race is a social construct. And of course, we hear Morrison say this all the time, that race is a social construct, but then it's also a distraction. And that racism is not like a simple product of individual bias. It's not that Michelle doesn't like me because of my like darker than butterscotch skin or my natural hair, or that, you know, Carolyn has this prejudice against me for whatever reason. It's not individualistic, individual bias or prejudice, but that it is fundamentally, systemically embedded in our legal systems and our policies in ways that make it impossible for racism not to be permanent. So that's so much of that critique frightens people who are foremost concerned with American mythology, American exceptionalism, whiteness is better, white supremacy in a way that is unabashed. It's not something that, you know, we have to be shy about. And we see her have this conversation in Paradise. So it's not just The Bluest Eye as a banned book. Paradise, she talks about, and I think it was Joey in the chat a little bit earlier talking about Paradise being banned in an incarcerated, it's a system of incarceration, a jail, where it seemed as though he suggested he had an experience. And Morrison, you know, talks about like how powerful it is. Like, if I can do that, you know, if I can incite a riot with a book, well, I've done my work here, you know? And I think Carolyn alluded to it as well. In Virginia, the thing that turned that race, that gubernatorial race, when it seemed as though Youngkin might have not been able to overcome his Democratic opponent, that school board. And Michelle and I were talking about this similarly, that the Steve Bannon playbook of go after the school boards. We're doing local races. Then the school boards can essentially control what we think and what we teach. If you can't control the population, because this is really about demographic anxiety, let's be clear, right? Like the fear of a Black planet, literally. So if you can't control the demographic, then you have to control the mind. That was a long-winded answer to your question about critical race theory, but
yeah, and it's not only that they don't want to, they only want to hear the good myth. They just can't take the criticisms. They can't take the realization that some things that's happened here were not good.
Yeah, and that's what she says about the Hiroshima, right? That's the thing that she says. You can't teach Hiroshima because it dares to say that a mistake was made.
And here is a populace that is primarily Christian, where forgiveness is at the center of that. But they can't bear to look at their own transgressions in the face. And it's, and I guess I go back to, you know, sort of reading the whole text, understanding, and they've used these sound bites to change elections. It's really tragic. I'd love to open the floor to the audience now. And
if you put your question in the chat, make sure to go ahead and put it in the Q&A as well so that we can read it and keep track of it and answer it. But I want to start with this question from Yure, who I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I know people sometimes get my name wrong, so I'm really sensitive to that. But they say, what should students do to ensure her literature, Morrison's literature, stays in our school at the board levels? Recently, Governor Youngkin, who we've discussed before, enacted a law against divisive concepts. So many things are now being taken away from my education, and I feel helpless. And, you know, I think that raises a good point. I also think of Florida and their the so-called Don't Say Gay bill. We've talked about teachers, we've talked about parents, but what actions can students take?
It's important. And I was thinking about this when Dana was talking about like the sort of model that Morrison offers. And like in this instance, I'm thinking specifically of two. So like the story that she tells about the white man who came to their house and her father like throws him down the stairs, and she's asked, well, why is that so important? And she says, because I learned that we could win, right? So a part of that is important because it helps to sort of underscore art and artists as hopeful, right? And to help you understand like that those activists were also hopeful. They thought they could win, right? So a part, like, it's important to understand that, to remember that part. The other thing that Morrison has taught us is to look to Black people for a model of what to do. And there is fugitive pedagogy, right? Like, so Black people learned about Black people during Jim Crow, when school boards also banned books in those segregated Black schools. So you need to pay attention to your archive, to our archives, and ask the questions about how we move towards the future based on how Black people won, you know, how we got to this particular point in our history when we did have these victories. So I do think that there is insight there. And there were fugitive pedagogies. There were Black teachers organizations and societies that that came together, and they figured out how to share their resources. And I think that those people can still be a model for us now.
Yeah. And I think what that can be made manifest in is are things like a student summit where there is a forum, there's an opportunity for students to talk about what impact this has on them as the readers. And I think, I guess I think often about, you know, the ways in which King used the Declaration of Independence and the political tracts or the legal tracts that Americans value to make his own point. It's sort of beating them at their own game. And so I think emphasizing the moral meaning of these texts in a wider forum could, and I think it did, like I said, I think in San Diego maybe, and there was a recension in Missouri where people, you know, the ACLU, the students, they got up and they talked and they explained to people what the real value of this text was. And some people were changing, some school boards changed their mind on this banning. So I think we need to, organizations like the Toni Morrison Society, like the National Council of Teachers English, like the History of the Project on Black Rights, I think that we need to find ways to give students a forum, not in the school auditorium, but a forum that gets attention, national attention, so students can, they are the readers, they're the ones who have the greatest amount to lose. And I just would like to see us give them a stage, a voice to express what this means to them, what this censorship means to them, and what reading these texts mean to them or could mean to them.
So Amanda has a question about this we've talked about the student's perspective just now, but also getting back into that parent's perspective. What are some things you wish parents were doing to counteract the banning and sheltering?
Quite simply, reading. Like if they read the book and read the book closely, then you can have the conversation with the students and with your children in ways that give you a sense of comfort about knowing exactly what's there. But if all you're doing is listening to clips or hearing things out of context and not understanding that this is a full picture, and I think Carolyn mentioned it a little bit before, and understand and accept and be honest about the fact that very often these cases are raced as well. So even with the kind of classic canonical text, it's usually like a race element that's in it that also makes it like banned, like the challenge towards that. But reading, I think, is the solid way to do it. Like read those books with your children before they have to read them.
Molly writes, a legitimate concern of parents may not be so much about scandalous content taken out of context, but frequently narrow and weaponized interpretations by teachers inadequately trained to use graphic material to thrust a politicized rather than literary reading on students. My own son literally hates Beloved after such a course, even though I've written my dissertation on it. How do you distinguish such approaches to sensitive topics? Maybe they're better at the college level?
Necessarily. No, I think it's important for young people to realize that your teachers may not share your political views or be limited. You know, when I was in high school, I cannot explain this. I don't know why. One day, I finally realized that after all these years of being in private school, that when these teachers were talking about the inner city, that I lived there. For whatever, I mean, all these years, I'd be like, "Oh, I mean, it's
Cracking
awful
up.
in
Wow.
that place,
Wherever
right?
that inner city
Wherever
is.
that is, that's awful. I'm afraid of that." And one day, I realized, man, that's supposed to be my house. And that was the day that I realized that they didn't know my life, right? That everything that I loved about who I was, they weren't accountable to it or for it. And in many ways, it drove my intellectual pursuits, not necessarily to prove them wrong, because I already knew that, but in order to make it possible for me to record my own understanding of the value of my life. So I don't necessarily think that your kid's teacher, I mean, not, of course they shouldn't be abusive, but I think it's also important for parents to make their children consequential witnesses to the violence that we experience in this world and the limitations of the people that we encounter along the way. So there's still some teaching that the parent can do in helping their child be a consequential witness.
Right. And it's just amazing to me that a teacher who has read the whole book can come away from Beloved without a hopeful message to his or her students. Somebody is not, to your point, Dana, somebody is not reading. And so I think one of the other things that we could do is really to bring in some reinforcements. And I think, and we're taking this seriously, largely because Morrison is on that list more than anybody else in the Toni Morrison Society, to say we need to bring in those pedagogical reinforcements, because it's just wrong on so many levels. But students can lose a real lesson in moral meaning. And that, I think, is really the tragedy here, is that everybody goes through trauma. Everybody has challenges. And if they think that it just stops there and that you don't dig deep and find out who you are, then, it's pointless.
And that is an important point, that I think that what you are doing in the process is you're alerting students to where their resources are. So your teacher is not your only resource.
Right.
And that is an important part of their education. I mean, even with college students, for me, it's very important that they understand what the dean does, what the registrar does, why you go to the provost, how structures work. That is a part of your education. So knowing that there are other people who are engaged in this reading, and that there are people that you could access, and societies that you can access. That's important.
Yeah.
And even beyond the college or the high school level, I think like Brigitte is in the Q&A with a comment, like more so than a question, or actually she says, are we going to continue to wait for permission for outsiders to resist? We can read Morrison to each other. I think that's the very point, like being in community with each other, like choosing Morrison books for book club. Carolyn and I both, I think, just did segments, and I think it's on YouTube. The YMCA, the big one, the famous one in New York, did all 10 of the books.
92nd Street.
Yep, 92nd Street, public and free. So if you say, all right, well, I want to read the book, but I need some help thinking about it, then you can take a look at, all right, we're going to read Sula. Everybody read Sula together. Family book club. Like so many things started to happen during the pandemic that I think we have these opportunities to take advantage of ourselves as resources as well, whether you're in a class or not. You know, the first time I finished Beloved, I was in a class, but I started reading it outside of a class, and like the Bluest Eye, I started, read outside of class. So I think those things are there as well.
That else I think is interesting, which maybe gets us off topic a little bit, but I think, Dana, you've mentioned this before in this forum and in others, that so much of this is race. If it's race and sex, people just go totally crazy and they can't get beyond those two things. I think of a text like Medea. Think about that. This woman kills her children. Jason says, I wish there were another way to have children where you didn't need women at all. I mean, no. That to me is dangerous, but nobody talks about that. Nobody has a problem with that. But if it's Pecola Breedlove, then, we're all up in arms. And if it's Setha, then the whole Virginia election turns on it. But
yeah, no, I think you're right. And my own more sinister position, which I could probably find evidence for, is again, with American literature, probably the most famous still now, even after having become an ancestor, writer of American literature is Toni Morrison. And the implication of that is race. Just literally, it literally really is. An American who has won the Nobel that you have to venerate, and then an American who's unabashedly Black. So somebody was saying in the chat a little bit earlier how Morrison's interview with Terry Gross, for instance, like where Gross was put off by the fact that Morrison's father, was like, get this man out of my house. The point that Michelle made, but even that had to be contextualized, because her point in telling that story very often, at least as she does in writing, is she says, my daddy didn't trust white people, period, under any circumstances. There was anything you could do and he didn't have anything for him. Get out, move. Insurance man can't even come here. He said, her mother, on the other hand, trusted everybody so absolutely completely. Like she judged people on an individual basis. Her point, even in that kind of tension, is to say both of those things lived in existence, and I observed both of those things. So I got a little bit of both. I'm not going to ever apologize for being a Black woman, but I also understand that I must judge people on the content of their character, if you will. So it's complicated.
I think that takes us to Peter's question, which I think is really interesting. And you all name, I'm thinking back to my own high school experience, and wow, I read Oedipus as a sophomore in high school, and that book is it was very good, but wow, it is some content, I will tell you that. Yeah. But there were lots of Black authors I did not discover unless they were on my father's bookshelf. And I think Peter has a good question, which is, and we hit on this a little bit. Do you think Morrison's work is more often banned or targeted than other authors? And if so, is it solely because of the content, or is it also because of the fact that she is Black and a woman?
Yeah, that's what I was gesturing toward. I think that certainly doesn't help. It complicates matters. And then again, because she was so completely confident in it. And the way that she would handle the question when people say, are you ever going to write a book about, white people? And she said, that's an absurd question. You would never ask anybody else a question. You would never ask a white author. Yeah. Right. You wouldn't ask a white author, are you going to ever write a book about Black people? Because it also connotes that writing about Black people isn't good enough. You say, I write about Black people because that's who I am, and because those are the most interesting people to me. That's where all of the action is. And similarly, when
she's easy, they don't know anybody else.
Yeah, and then that notion
she's
that
an easy target.
not understanding that that in and of itself has a level of racism to it. So I do think, to Peter's question, that being a woman plays a part in it, and then being a Black woman plays another part in it, in terms of it's an easy target. And so you can really, what do you call it, when you like you throw stuff off of, you can project a lot of stuff. And so again, she talks about that, like, what do? You project your fears of your own inadequacy into Black bodies. That's the work that Playing in the Dark does. When she talks about, all right, y'all want me to talk about white literature? I'm gonna give you 4 chapters of nothing but white literature, and watch how the Africanist presence turns the whole conversation. If you need something to change, you got to drop a Black character in there so that you can project your fear of landlessness, of uncertainty, of everything. You project it onto this Black body. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a lot of what happens also to her with the banning books, projected onto these books, because I'm not sure what it means to be an American in 2021, 2022.
Mm. Yeah, that's why I think we need, a whole redemptive strategy here to save these people from themselves, and in the process to really put the value of this literature where it belongs. Yeah, I'm really worried about what's going to happen to the young people who are in high school if they're having to suffer under these kinds of barbs. It's just.
All right, well, I think we might have time for one more question or two. Consuelo asks a question for towards the end, which is where we are. What are some books that could easily get banned, but that are important to each of you that our audience should read?
I think mine is going to be Daniel Black's The Coming, which is probably somewhere behind me, somewhere close by. Literally, and I'll drop the title in the chat. It's The Coming, and the author is Daniel Black. And it could easily be banned because it tells the truth, at least from a fictionalized perspective, of the Middle Passage and how people are taken from one place. The healers are taken, the seers are taken, the metal workers are taken, the farmers are taken, and then you watch them have a corporate narrative voice about what it means to be brought into this space and ultimately to survive. It doesn't have like all of the quote unquote sexy things of banned books, but the truth of the way that it overturns an understanding of what it means to be a Black person in this space could easily be a banned book based on that list of reasons why books shouldn't be in prisons. Like the fear of inciting a riot, that book would incite a riot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't really think. I mean, for me, the one sort of thing that I think that every student for me is required to read is actually an essay. Bell Hooks' Loving Blackness as Political Resistance. And I think that is it. If there was one thing I wish that I could have written, is that, and I write about it so much. I think I'm trying to convince myself that I did write that essay. But like, that's it, because what happens for me with that essay and why it's so powerful is that she begins with this reading of passing, and she highlights, the fact that this woman chooses Blackness. And so she says, loving Blackness is dangerous in a white supremacist society, so much so that Claire has to die. And a part of why that then becomes so important is because in this world where there is this all-pervading desire to inculcate disdain for everything Black, to quote Du Bois, the fact that you figured out that Blackness was worth loving is dangerous, because where did you get that idea from? Mm-hmm. But once you discover it, what happens is you get to figure out how to live a life that's not entangled and required to be in communication with white supremacy for your existence. Race is antagonistic, necessarily so. And you need whiteness and an antagonism with whiteness in order to have meaning. And loving Blackness breaks you free from that. And I'm interested in liberation. and living like I'm free. And that essay is sort of the beginning of how you can begin to craft that kind of life.
Yeah.
So if these people ever read Bell Hooks, you know she's about to be on the list.
Yeah, well, mine are all Toni Morrison, so they're already on the list.
Yeah.
All right. With that, we will move to closing remarks from each of you. Let's start with Michelle.
Well, I'm glad that that so many people are interested in this conversation, and I think that reading Toni Morrison is important because of the way that you encounter what loving Blackness looks like. And the radical possibility for thinking something else about who you can be. There's a model for that. This is a woman who won every major writing award you can think of, but she spent all of her time pretty much thinking about everyday, simple Black people. And making their lives profound. And that in and of itself is worthy of meditation. It makes you rethink the most marginalized in our citizenry. And perhaps maybe thinking about how we live differently with those people. So I think it's important that people continue to read Morrison with the understanding that reading is rereading and that it is a verb and not a noun. And so oftentimes it's in the rereading that you have greater appreciation for the brilliance that was Toni Morrison.
Carolyn, how about you?
Well, I first want to thank Literacy Partners again for the wonderful marathon reading of The Bluest Eye last month, and for putting Morrison's work out there at a time when we're all hunkered down, or halfway hunkered down, I guess, with COVID. And I really do want to thank you for that, and to thank you for this opportunity for us to have a kind of talk back session on that, about teaching and reading and critical writing about these works and how they impact what we do in the society. I'd like to say that I really do, I mean, we in the society really do take seriously our role in providing resources for teachers, and we will be doing more of that. We had the Language Matters series. We will be beginning in May, beginning the celebration of our 30th anniversary in May 2023. So we'll have a year-long celebration. And one of the things that we want to do is to launch the Language Matters 2 initiative, where we really will be trying to codify these pedagogies of resistance, you know, to give teachers to the tools they need to deal with these contested works. And so I encourage you to continue to be in touch with the work of the society, to go to our website at ToniMorrisonSociety.org to see what's upcoming and the kinds of programs that we do. And we certainly hope that you will join us in that effort if you're not already a member. And I'd just like to thank Michelle and Dana for their work. And Catherine, thank you so much for coming on. This is the kind of work that we want to do and the kind of voice that we want to give to the works of Toni Morrison. So thank you very much.
And Dana?
I want to say similarly, just thank you to everybody, Literacy Partners, and thank you to everybody who joined. I mean, there are so many ways that you can spend a Tuesday night. We also wanted to make sure that we kept it tight. So we were really adamant about like an hour and not going over much more than that. So thank you all for joining us. As Carolyn suggested, the work of the Toni Morrison Society is so critical, so important to doing this work. We want, I mean, it's open for everybody. There really is something for everybody. And we do everything from the children's books all the way up. So it's not just for academics. It's not just for people who are in college. or just graduated, or like a lot of us are participants because of the Author Society nature of the work that we do, but inviting everybody into the space because we're all a community of readers. And then I also want to send a special shout out here also to Jacqueline Hill, who was a former student at Howard, but who is just like an incredible producer. She's senior producer at NPR for 1A, great show. And then also the developer of the podcast Through the Cracks, which is award-winning in and of itself. So be on the lookout. When Jacqueline Hill like is larger than life, you can be like, I can remember when I was on that Morrison thing when, you know, JQ as we call her. So thank you also to JQ. And I'll end like just with a quick little thing from Morrison, from The Bluest Eye, especially since that was the book that Literacy Partners had us focus on. It's actually from the foreword of one of the later editions. When she talks about what she was trying to do in Beloved, she says the other problem, of course, was language. Holding the despising glance while sabotaging it was difficult. The novel tried to hit the raw nerve of racial self-contempt, expose it, then soothe it, not with narcotics, but with language that replicated the agency I discovered in my first experience of beauty. Because that moment was so racially infused, my revulsion at what my school friend wanted, very blue eyes and very black skin, the harm she was doing to my concept of beautiful. The struggle was for writing that was indisputably Black. I don't yet know quite what that is, but neither that nor the attempts to disqualify an effort to find out keeps me from trying to pursue it. What she tries to do with language is part of what we also try to do with the society, with that notion of language matters. It does matter. Books matter. So let's do all that we can to keep books from being banned. Let's push back against censorship and do our work on our part to make sure that people can read Toni Morrison. And I also have to shout out Catherine Saunders. Thank you, Catherine, who was behind the scenes and our tech person. Really appreciate all of the tech work that you have done. Just appreciate everybody and this opportunity to spend some time with you to talk about Toni Morrison.
So to learn more about the Toni Morrison Society, visit ToniMorrisonSociety.org. And to learn more about Literacy Partners, visit literacypartners.org. Thank all of you for joining and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.